1 Samuel chapter 27. We're splitting our reading tonight because we're looking at 1 Samuel 27 verse 1 to chapter 28 verse 2, and then we're also looking at chapter 29, which is, you might think is a bit weird, but you'll see why we're doing that in a minute. So we're going to read the first bit now, 1 Samuel 27 verse 1 to 28 verse 2, then we're going to read 1 Samuel 29, and then we'll preach, or I'll preach, on both of those passages together. So 1 Samuel 27, starting at verse 1, reading to 28 verse 2. But David thought to himself, one of these days I shall be destroyed by the hand of Saul. The best thing I can do is escape to the land of the Philistines. Then Saul will give up searching for me anywhere in Israel, and I will slip out of his hand. So David and the 600 men with him left and went over to Achish, son of Maok, king of Gath. David and his men settled in Gath with Achish. Each man had his family with him, and David had sent his two wives, Ahinoam of Jezreel and Abigail of Carmel, the widow of Nabal. When Saul was told that David had fled to Gath, he no longer searched for him. Then David said to Achish, if I have found favour in your eyes, let a place be assigned to me in one of the country towns that I may live there. Why should your servant live in the royal city with you? So on that day Achish gave him Ziklag, and it has belonged to the kings of Judah ever since. David lived in Philistine territory for a year and 4 months. Now David and his men went up and raided the Geshurites, the Girzites and the Amalekites. From ancient times these people had lived in the land extending to Shur and Egypt. Whenever David attacked an area, he did not leave a man or woman alive, but took sheep and cattle, donkeys and camels and clothes. Then he returned to Achish. When Achish asked, where did you go raiding today? David would say, against the Negev of Judah, or against the Negev of Jerahmeel, or against the Negev of the Kenites. He did not leave a man or woman alive to be brought to Gath, for he thought, they might inform on us and say, this is what David did. And such was his practice as long as he lived in Philistine territory. Achish trusted David and said to himself, he has become so obnoxious to his people, the Israelites, that he will be my servant for life. In those days the Philistines gathered their forces to fight against Israel. Achish said to David, you must understand that you and your men will accompany me in the army. David said, then you will see for yourself what your servant can do. Achish replied, very well, I will make you my bodyguard for life. So now we're going to read 1 Samuel 29. 1 Samuel 29 then says this. The Philistines gathered all their forces at Aphek, and Israel camped by the spring of Jezreel. As the Philistine rulers marched with their units of hundreds and thousands, David and his men were marching at the rear with Achish. The commanders of the Philistines asked, what about these Hebrews? Achish replied, is this not David, who was an officer of Saul, king of Israel? He has already been with me for over a year, and from the day he left Saul until now I have found no fault in him. But the Philistine commanders were angry with Achish and said, send the man back, that he may return to the place you assigned him. He must not go with us into battle, or he will turn against us during the fighting. How better could he regain his master's favour than by taking the heads of our own men? Isn't this the David they sang about in their dances? Saul has slain his thousands and David his tens of thousands. So Achish called David and said to him, as surely as the Lord lives, you have been reliable, and I would be pleased for you to serve with me in the army from the day that you came to me until now. I have found no fault in you. But the rulers don't approve of you. Now turn back and go in peace. Do nothing to displease the Philistine rulers. But what have I done? David asked. What have you found against your servant from the day that I came to you until now? Why can't I go and fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Achish answered, I know that you've been as pleasing in my eyes as any angel of God. Nevertheless, the Philistine commanders have said, he must not go up with us into battle. Now get up early, along with your master's servants who have come with you, and leave in the morning as soon as it is light. So David and his men got up early in the morning to go back to the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. So remember where we're up to. We've been going through 1 Samuel for quite a while, but particularly in recent chapters, the game of cat and mouse between Saul and David has been kind of rumbling on. David's been on the run. Saul has been chasing him. Saul got briefly distracted in having to go off to war to fight the Philistines to protect his kingdom, but as soon as that was done, as soon as he could get back to it, he returned to hunting David down. During that whole process, the backwards and forwards, the cat and mouse, twice David has had the opportunity to kill Saul. And yet, in each of those cases, he trusted the Lord and didn't lay a hand on the person who he still regularly refers to as the Lord's anointed one. David knows it's not his place to decide when Saul's life will end and when his reign will be complete and when the promises made to him by God will come to fruition. It's been backwards and forwards. It's been kind of like, some kind of soap opera or some kind of like drama series. There's been kind of cliffhangers each time, wondering what's going to happen, what's going on. By the end of chapter 26 then, Saul has again said, not for the first time, to David that he won't chase him anymore. That that's it, finished, game over, cat and mouse, done. Saul has commended David and condemned himself for being foolish and acting sinfully. David, on the other hand, at the end of chapter 26, has called on the Lord to protect him, to save his life, to deliver him from trouble because he has acted righteously when it's come to Saul. He could have killed him, like we said, twice, but hasn't done so. And at the end of 26, Saul and David head their separate ways again. Saul goes home, David goes on his way, and then we get to this point, chapter 27. And we find a story that's probably quite surprising to us. So have a look at chapter 27. I don't think it's what we expect. We find at the beginning of chapter 27, David thought to himself. Literally speaking, David is talking to his own heart. And his conclusion is, I can't trust Saul, which is a pretty fair conclusion, isn't it? I mean, Saul has literally been all over the place. And David is, I can't trust him, so let's just think about this for a minute. And David's fear, really, that comes to the fore is, if this current game of cat and mouse continues, eventually the cat will win. Eventually, Saul is going to get me. Eventually, it's going to be my head on the block and my life will be ended. Saul's going to win. He's got more people. He's got more resources. I'm on the run. David has maybe mulled over Saul's track record, which, like we say, was fairly schizophrenic. 1 minute he blesses David, the next minute he's chasing him down with an army. He's probably looked at the men around him again and thought, man, I've got 600 men, not a bad fighting force to come from nowhere, but their families are with me. We're basically refugees. We've got no place to call home. We're shattered, we're worn out, and we're malnourished. And maybe he just thought to himself, you know what, I'm just sick. I'm just sick of being on the run. I can't be bothered to keep moving from place to place, to cave, to wondering whether at any moment on the horizon I'm going to see Saul and his army and their banners and their chariots and whatever else. I just need a little bit of downtime. I'm sick of looking over my shoulder. And so he says to himself, right, I know what I should do. I'll get out of Israel altogether. and I'll go and take some refuge in the Philistines' land. Now, as we think about it, as the context, we sympathize with David, right? We sit there and go, yeah, it must be pretty brutal to be on the run constantly from the king. You're under-resourced, you've manpower, food, all sorts, everything stacked in Saul's favour. We would think, okay, I can see how I would have made probably the same choice in David's situation. I've got to the end of it. I just can't be bothered anymore to keep on running. It must have been physically, emotionally, and mentally exhausting for David and for the rest of his men. Is the next battle imminent? Where's the next meal coming from? We empathise with him, right? We empathise with David. We can see exactly why he makes that decision. Because although we might not be on the run from somebody trying to kill us, at least I don't think any of you are. That's not a circumstance I'm aware of within the building. We're not on the run from anybody trying to kill us, but actually life quite often throws up things that we just think, I can't be bothered anymore. The daily grind of church and work and family and friends, keeping on top of all the jobs that need doing in the house, cooking meals, balancing incomings and outgoings. Sometimes that just becomes overwhelming. Difficult enough to do that without adding in illness for you or illness for the kids or the insecurity of a job. You get the notice to the thing, we're going to have to make cuts and you might be one of the people we have to let go. A tough relationship with a close friend that used to be a source of relief and joy is now fractured. There's discouragement at church. Even non-Christian friend who seemed to be so interested in the gospel now wants nothing to do with it. Doesn't want to hear the name of Jesus. Doesn't want to think about the Bible anymore. And on top of that, our own lives, if we manage to somehow lift our eyes from our own set of circumstances, we then look immediately around us and find people struggling with the cost of living. We see moral structures in society being eroded. We see Christians being marginalised for expressing their faith, even in sometimes very subtle ways. And then if we look a little bit further outside of that again, we find that the world really is just a big, broken place. We flick on the news, we open the BBC app on our phones, we read the paper, and we find plenty of things to get us down, don't we? The war in the Ukraine goes on. There's civil war in various parts of Africa. There's Islamic extremism in other parts of the world. There's inequality seemingly everywhere, poverty all over the place. What do we do in that situation? Where do we turn? David here lets those things that are happening to him lead him to just think to himself. Doesn't do what he did before. So before this, David has, in hard circumstances, lifted his eyes to the Lord. The Lord who at the end of chapter 26, he said, is going to protect him. He trusts that the Lord will protect him. The Lord who throughout the last 9 chapters of this book has amazingly rescued him and kept him, and he's shown him twice at least that Saul's protection is gone. Because David had him, didn't he? Had him ready to kill him if he wanted to. The same Lord who's promised him the kingdom, this time David lets what's going on around him get on top of him, and as a result he thinks, look, the best course of action, I'll go and live amongst Israel's enemies. David has at this point listened to himself rather than talking to himself. He's listened to his own fears, to his own doubts, rather than saying to himself, right, I need to remember the truth. I need to preach the truth to myself. I need to think, this is what God has said. This is what God has done. And I can trust him with that. Talking to yourself is not the first sign of madness, by the way. More a sign of wisdom. We can learn from David here, in reality, that if we fail to preach to ourselves instead of listening to ourselves, we're likely to make unwise decisions. Now, this is one of these chapters in the Bible where people have different opinions as to whether David is right or wrong. My conclusion is that David is unwise here. Some people argue that David is wise because in verse 4 it says that Saul did exactly what David hoped he would do, which was stop chasing him. That's what David wanted. That's what happened. Surely that's a wise choice from David. But I think that the key thing with this passage is that actually it's a godless chapter. You read chapter 27 in 1 Samuel, no mention of God, no mention of the Lord's name anywhere from beginning to end. I think often with godless chapters there's 2 things about them. One is they're often quite hard to interpret. You don't particularly learn anything about God, you aren't told anything God's doing or saying or people responding to God. But also in here I think in comparison to the other times we've seen David in a quandary, there's no mention of God. And so I think we're supposed to read it and say, David here is not acting wisely. He doesn't go to God and ask God for help where he has done before. This is, yes, a very understandable decision from David. Absolutely. We can completely empathise with him, but it's not a decision that is full of faith. David has let his circumstances become bigger than the promise-keeping, wonderfully gracious God who's kept him safe and saved him on multiple occasions already. David only really consults himself rather than the Lord. So I think actually what we find here is David's faith faltering and not trusting God. Instead, he looks to Philistine refuge and Philistine help rather than refuge in the Lord and help from the Lord. What might we do thinking about the circumstances that we face? I gave some examples a few minutes ago of things that sometimes overwhelm us in life. They might not be what overwhelms you, but there will be things that do overwhelm you. Surely, we all have situations that feel like they're too big to handle. in those cases, where do we look for help and security? Where do we find refuge when things are tough and when we're at breaking point? Do we look for refuge in our own abilities? Do we look for refuge in financial reserves? So we go, right, well, I've got plenty of money, so I'll cheer myself up by buying some stuff. Do we retreat into our shell and go, right, I just need to have plenty of me time. I'll just shut the world out until things get easier. Do we place our hope in a spouse or in a best friend? Or do we have a particular escape route that we run to? Maybe it's too much drink, maybe it's too much drugs, maybe it's something else. Now, I don't want to say, look, here's just a message where we say, pull up your socks and trust God, because it's not, in one sense, it's that simple, but that's not the compassionate way to think about it, is it? We've said already, we sympathize with David. We can say exactly why in this position he does what he does. It makes sense. We're supposed to understand David's choice. But I think it's also there to show us that although David is a hero that we rightly look up to often in Scripture, he's not perfect. He's flawed. He's a human being like us. He is the king after God's own heart. He is the king who is now going to be the anointed one. There's going to be lots of great things happening in David's life. And the promised line of the Messiah comes through him, but David himself is not the Messiah. He's not perfect. He doesn't trust God all the time. And when we are in those circumstances that overwhelm us and are so tough we just think, I can't be bothered anymore, we shouldn't ever turn round to one another and glibly say, just trust the Lord, it'll be okay. I don't think that would have helped David here. I think David would have turned around and gone, well, you do it then. You look after these men, you provide their food, you look after their families, you fight Saul, you keep running. Trusting the Lord is the ultimate answer when things are tough, but it needs to be done and said in a context of relationship, of compassion, of care, of love for one another, walking with each other step by step, helping each other to see in specific situations how God is bigger than that circumstance, however many and varied those circumstances might be. David here needed reminding, didn't he, of what had taken place in the previous weeks and months. He needed some encouragement to persevere and to find his refuge in the Lord and the Lord alone. We need to do that. We need to help one another lift our heads, lift our eyes to the hills, to where our help comes from. Our help comes from the Lord, the maker of heaven and earth. From the Father who loves us so much that he sent his Son to die for us. From the Son who obeyed his Father, even though the religious leaders sought his life, even though he was betrayed by those closest to him and went to the cross so that we might be saved. And we might do that in a variety of ways. It might be that we regularly meet up with each other to pray, or we pop in on someone and have a cup of coffee with them. It might be that we plan to read the Bible together. It might be that we chat honestly after a church service and just say, look, life is rubbish at the minute. Feels like I've got a 10-ton weight on my back and I don't know how to lift it. But in that moment, in those things, we need to seek first the Lord's will for us, for his strength to persevere. And often we get that through the help of brothers and sisters in Christ who walk with us. We need to lean on the Lord and make wise choices with the brains he's given us, rather than use the brains he's given us to make a choice and then somehow try and shoehorn God into it. So David then heads to Gath, we're told. Speaks to Achish. Achish thinks, all right, yeah, I'll have him. He can stay here. David's an enemy of Saul. He thinks having David around will be a great advantage to him, Achish. So he thinks the logic of, well, my enemy's enemy will be my friend. So I'll have David. Maybe David will turn out to be the deciding factor next time we fight against Saul. David then cleverly, while he's there, he's not daft, is he? He cleverly, while he's there, chooses or asks if he can live in Ziklag. Ziklag is a good 20-odd miles away from Gath. He says, I don't want to be a burden to you. Why should I get the privilege of living in a royal city? Just let me have Ziklag. I'll just get out your hair. I'll be around. I'll do some stuff. I'll help you out, but I'll not cause too much trouble for you. So he goes to Ziklag, a town which is, interestingly, actually part of the promised land given to Judah, but hadn't been conquered. And we're told that David remained in the land, and that land then remained with the kings of Israel from this point on. David then does a whole bunch of stuff while he's there. He attacks various people. Actually, what some of the stuff he does is he completes unfinished work that the Israelites didn't complete when they went into the land in the first place. So there are some good things to come out of this, out of David's unwise choice. But also we find that David does some probably slightly sketchy stuff when he's there. His reasoning for wiping out all the people in those places is so that they don't rat on him, to Achish. Now David might have thought, well look, I remember what the promises were to God, we need to drive the people out of the land, but he's not explicitly told that. And the narrator deliberately doesn't comment on it for us. I think we're supposed to say, again, because it's a godless chapter, that David here is not making the right choice. Some of this is going to work for good for Israel and for David, but David has made unwise decisions to get there. Now, if we'd left it at the end of verse 2, it's a cliffhanger, isn't it? Because actually, if we get to the end of verse 2 of chapter 28, David is marching there with the Philistine army to fight who? The Israelites. So at this point we're going, okay, David is marching towards Saul with the Philistines ranked together. What's going to happen? Because actually if you think about the outcomes there's no good one for David, is there? David is now seen to be with the Philistines if he gets there. And to any average Israelite, when he comes to claim the kingship, they're going to go, why would we want you as our king? You stood with our enemies to fight against us. If he tries to get out of it, well, Achish, he'll just get killed by the Philistines. David is in a bit of a quandary. In fact, he's in a situation he's not going to be able to get himself out of, humanly speaking. There is no way out for him here. That's why we're doing chapter 29. I'm not going to leave you on a cliffhanger. Nancy and I have just been started re-watching Line of Duty, if anybody's seen that before, BBC programme. We haven't seen the whole lot, so don't ruin the end, because we haven't got there yet either. But we're about to get the end, thanks. We get to the end of just Steve's making symbols to be trying to tell me what happens. We're nearly at the end of season 2, which I have seen before, but I can't remember exactly how they do it. All the plot lines at the minute are left hanging. There's one episode to go, but there's a lot of things that need tying up. And when the credits roll, you're like, no! I haven't got time to watch this one now. It's too late at night and I'm too tired. I can't stay up till daft o'clock in the morning anymore. I'm not a student. My body doesn't allow me to do that anymore. Unless usually we'd watch the next one straight away with the time to do it. So tonight, you're not going to be left on a cliffhanger. You're not going to think, how's David going to get out of this? But I think the writer does it for that reason. So I think the end chapters here in Samuel are split for a reason. I've brought them together, yes. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do, but we're telling the whole story here. But they're split for a reason. So you've got David, then Saul, then David, then Saul. It's setting up the contrast of here is Saul's kingship coming to an end, here is David's kingship beginning. And the contrast that's been going all the way there is split here by this almost split screen stuff that's happening. Now, if you've got a decent study Bible, it'll tell you the timeline of chapters 27 to 31. It'll piece together the days that they're apart, because they're not in chronological order either. If you want to go away and look that up, you can. Didn't have time to talk about it tonight. But here we are. We are going to find out David's fate, chapter 29. And I think what we find here is God's surprising and merciful solution to David. So look at verses 2 and 3 of chapter 29. David is marching now with the units of hundreds and thousands of Philistines. But there's a problem. Problem for David, yes, he looks like he's lining up to kill his own countrymen, and that is going to be ruining his chances of ruling in Israel. But there's a problem for the Philistine commanders as well. They're looking and going, hold on, why have we got a bunch of Hebrews stood here with us? What are they doing here? Who invited them? Where have they come from? And so they go to Achish, what are you doing, mate? Have you lost your mind? What have you brought what are these 600 men doing here? Don't you know who they are? The problem for them is they're suspicious. And actually they've got good right to be suspicious, because in chapter 14 verses 20 and 21, Hebrews who were amongst Philistines lining up for battle before did turn on them and kill them. Camped with them. Turned round and butchered them basically. So the Philistine commanders don't agree with Achish. Achish is like, yeah, but he's been with me for a year and a bit. He's done great. I've never seen any problem with him. We know that David's been covering it up all the way, but Achish on it thinks, oh no, David's all right here. Anyway, the Philistine rulers just go, not a chance. Remember the song? Saul has killed his thousands. David has killed his tens of thousands. How many of those tens of thousands were Philistines? We're not having him here. I don't care what you say, Achish. There's no way I'm lining up shoulder to shoulder with him. Send him home. Anyway, I imagine they had a pretty heated debate, and eventually Achish goes, okay, I'll have to send him home because he doesn't have the votes. So effectively they put it to that vote, and Achish is outvoted. And so Achish comes to David, kind of, waxes lyrical to David. He's the perfect diplomat. He's like, look, David, it's out of my hands, mate. I really like you. I think you're great. You've been brilliant for me. The rest of these guys, though, they've not seen that and they don't trust you. And, because Philistines, we go into war together. It's all for one for all, a bit like the Musketeers. We have to go with the majority on this one. So just, head back to Ziklag, will you, please? Don't cause me any trouble. I don't want to fight with them. I don't want to fight with you. I don't want them to have any more reason to be suspicious of you than they already are. Let's just go to sleep now, get up in the morning, head home, and, I'll see you later. Now, David outwardly protests, doesn't he? He kind of has to. Because if he's too happy about it, Achish is going to go, something's not right here. So he says, but, what have I done wrong? And, surely I could go in and you'd get to see what I would be like. And, actually, he refers to, we think, Achish as my lord the king. But interestingly, David's words are ambiguous. Again, deliberately ambiguous. He calls, we think, Achish my lord the king, but David could be talking about Saul, or he could be talking about Yahweh. He could be saying, actually, if you'd let me stay, you would have really seen what I could do, because I'd have killed you. I'd have killed you as the enemies. Whatever he's saying, he says it in such a way that it makes him look good again, and Achish allows him to part easily. But I think we're supposed to be surprised at this. I think we're supposed to have come from chapter 27 or chapter 28 verses 1 and 2 to chapter 29 and gone, David had no way out. Anything of his own making was going to land him in hot water, but God has been merciful to David. God's mercy has been far-reaching. It has pursued David even into enemy territory, even to the point, it seems, of no return. The author doesn't announce it. The author doesn't tell us, here's God's mercy. He doesn't explain what's going on, but we're supposed to work it out. We're supposed to see that it is only God's mercy that gets David out of his mess. Why do I say mercy? Mercy because, by definition, mercy is us not getting what we do deserve. And actually, by rights, David has been unwise and sinful, and so actually, if he'd got himself in a mess, he deserved to face the consequences for it. But God mercifully gets him out of it. God mercifully acts so that David is rescued. David's wisdom can't get him out of the mess, but God's mercy does. David's faint in faith at the beginning of chapter 27 doesn't cancel out God's great mercy and sovereignty. God's mercy is now on display to David. But how amazing how it comes about. No big fireworks, no Houdini-esque escape for David. It comes about because Philistine leaders are simply and rightly suspicious of Hebrews fighting with them. It's a natural everyday reaction, isn't it? But that natural everyday reaction of the Philistine leaders is the means of God's mercy to David. Quite mundane, quite sensible response of the Philistine leaders God uses to get David out of the mess he's created for himself. God uses the enemies of his people to save his chosen king. In one fell swoop, God gets David away from the battle. He doesn't die, none of his men die, none of their families die. He provides David with an alibi for the death of Saul, which we're going to find out about in the next couple of weeks. When Saul dies later on, David is 100 miles away from the battle, which means nobody could turn around and say, David just came in and was like, I want the kingship, popped Saul off, here we go. He could have nothing to do with it because he was so far away from it. I think the thing that this then teaches us and why we put these two together really is this. Here is the mercy of God which gives us real hope when we've failed, when we've messed up, when we've made mistakes. Here is the mercy of God, a God who is not surprised and not thwarted by our decision to walk in our own wisdom rather than his. I know that I hope that we're all aware that our faith fluctuates, doesn't it? One minute we feel like we can take on any challenge in the world for the sake of the gospel, and the next minute we feel so discouraged we want to give it all up. One minute we're letting everything rest in the hands of God, whether that's our finances, our future, our health, our education, our children's education, but then almost immediately we turn into something else for comfort, for hope, other than the Lord, because we want to control it ourselves. We go from letting God be God and believing that He has what is best for us, to wanting to be God ourselves and thinking we know what is best for us. But are we aware of the mercy of God so much in our lives as we are of our own sin? This passage should encourage us to look for the silent but beautiful mercy of God in our lives and the lives of others. How God works to bring things about for us despite ourselves. Passage doesn't, as any Bible passage, doesn't give us license to sin so that God's mercy will be more clearly seen. That will be misunderstanding of mercy and of grace. But when we see the work of God in our lives, this merciful work in our lives and the lives of other people, we should marvel at the fact that He is merciful. David had failed to trust God, so logic would say God should leave David to sort out his own mess. But God doesn't work according to the way we think these things should happen. God continues to be merciful. God continues to be gracious. Our sins cannot outweigh or exhaust His mercy and grace. That's why we sang what we sang. Our sins, they are many, but His mercy is more. In one sense, the key thing in that line is more, isn't it? So when we are too aware of our own fragile, failing faith, we simply need to look at the cross where we see the mercy of God on display. Because as we look at the cross of Jesus, we can emphatically see God is merciful, that God is gracious. In fact, not just we can see that, but the whole world can see that. Because Jesus, the one who deserved no punishment because He was innocent, had never failed to trust His Father, had never sinned, hangs on the cruel cross to take the punishment for you and I if we trust in Him. It's because of the cross that we receive mercy. It's actually because of the cross that David received mercy. The basis for mercy is the fact that the promised King, the Messiah, was coming to save. And it's then because of the cross that we can be sure that God will continue to be merciful to us, know what is best for us, and hopefully continually surprise us at how merciful and gracious He is. We may never cease to be amazed by the mercy and grace of God. Because again, as we said this morning, and I didn't plan for these two things to overlap in particular, but they just did. Even when we are faithless, He is faithful. Even when David was faithless, even when David acted in his own strength, or according to his own ideas, God was still merciful to him. And that's a wonderful thing to see.